Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. And today we're going to be talking about math and Dragon Ball Z. so, I make it no secret that I am a Dragon Ball fan. I have been for over 25 years. Oh my god, that's like great and horrifying at the same time because time just keeps on zooming. But part of that comes from my experience with Dragon Ball Z growing up. Dragon Ball Z has been a big part of my childhood. It's been a big part of my adult life. And it's what brought me into Dragon Ball, what made me a fan. And it's affected my life in various ways. Still currently, because if you've been following my videos for quite some time, then you'll know that I have a whole bunch of Dragon Ball videos. I have a Math and Dragon Ball series, and I'll leave a link in the description. And yeah, so when it comes to Dragon Ball Z, I've talked about it in various ways, but I haven't had a dedicated video to it, and I want to talk about it, and my experiences with it growing up, and my experiences with it now, and you are free to assume that there will be spoilers ahead. There absolutely will be spoilers ahead. I'm telling you that now. If you don't care, or you've already seen and or read Dragon Ball, then you're good. That being said, spoilers ahead, and we'll take it from there. All right, let's get started. And again, spoilers ahead. So, what I want to do in this video is I want to start off with talking about um, Dragon Ball Z, just in a broader scope, and then zooming down into the sanity. You'll see what I mean, and I'll be jumping around the place with it, but like in a way that will make sense for me, and I hope makes sense for you. And I'll be talking about my experience over the years with Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball as a whole. So when it comes to Dragon Ball Z, it is the sequel series to Dragon Ball, and both are adaptations of the Dragon Ball manga. And the Z portion of the story is a lot of it. The original manga, if I'm not mistaken, is 519 chapters. And of those 519 chapters, 325 are Z. They're that portion of the story, right? Like, depending on where you read it, you would have read it as Dragon Ball the way throughout. But in some cases, depending on where you're from or depending on where you're getting the manga, you'll see the series split up like the anime is. But either way, the Z portion is a lot of the story. And then when you jump to the anime, Dragon Ball, I think, if I recall, is 184 episodes. And then with Dragon Ball Z, it's 291, um, which is kind of crazy. And yeah, with Dragon Ball Kai, that is drastically reduced. But like, there was filler in Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, and Kai cuts out some of the filler, but not all. But it's just like if they remade Dragon Ball, and cut out a lot of the filler, it would be a bit shorter too. But my whole thing though is just that Dragon Ball Z is a huge part of the series, right? And for me growing up, that's how I was introduced into Dragon Ball. And like I had the privilege of seeing the first episode, but it was interesting because like I didn't know Dragon Ball existed at the time, and neither did a lot of other people. So we had this weird experience where if you got into Dragon Ball through Dragon Ball Z, then Dragon Ball felt like a prequel to you, even though it was the initial material, and Dragon Ball Z is the continuation of that material, right? Like, so it was kind of a wild experience. But anyway, I got into it on the first episode, which was already insane. And that first episode was important for a number of reasons. One, it was a time skip from the original Dragon Ball. Goku has he's married to Chi Chi at this point. He has Gohan, and they establish several things in these beginning episodes, right? They establish where like Goku and Piccolo are power wise first through just like well, kind of I'm trying to think back, like kind of first from just kind of statements and stuff like that. But we see very early on that power levels are going to be a thing, right? Like we see this because of Raditz. Raditz is an interesting character because like one, he was a phenomenal like challenge to Goku and Piccolo in the beginning, but also he introduced lore like Goku being an alien, and then Gohan being part alien himself because they're Saiyans. And there's so much that has come from them being Saiyans. And I think that's fascinating. So I'm gonna get into that beginning segment and like a little bit more about Raditz's importance, and then kind of jump from there as we go on. Because see, here's the thing, right? Not only was Raditz powerful, and we're given an idea of his power. I think I want to say like 1200 or something like that, and we might be given that a little later on. But either way, that's what we're dealing with. And with Goku and Piccolo, if I'm not mistaken, they were both around 300 in their base without fire and ki blast. So that gives you an idea of like the stakes, right? And also Gohan is introduced Z, and he's shown to have a crazy power that allows him to compete with someone like Raditz, even at being like 4 years old. And I think originally he was supposed to be three or something. I don't know. It's crazy. Um, but anyway, so they're fighting Raditz, and the fight with Raditz does a whole bunch of crazy things because it introduces the idea of power levels and power scaling. And at the same time, in doing so, it lets you know that Raditz is a threat. And it gives you an idea of how much of a threat he is. And it gives you an idea of how strong these fighters are compared to like a regular person because they show like the power level of a farmer, and I think it's like five. In any case, what I find interesting about that is like, so the power level thing eventually gets subverted, and we'll get to that. But I just think it's interesting, right? Because like with power levels or battle power, if you prefer, and with those two things, right? Like you have long lasting effects because you have the idea of power scaling, which is something that us is in the Dragon Ball community can't let go of till this day, and I don't think that's an inherently bad thing, and we'll get to that too. But so I find it fascinating because from the jump, we're given this idea of power levels, and they did measure people's power, but also from the jump, we're seeing that like when Goku and Piccolo are firing their ki blast, this allows them to raise their power level in an instant, in a burst, and that's something that Raditz is not prepared for, and that's fascinating. And later on, we see that our characters can raise or lower their key as they choose, which can subvert the idea of power levels. And for the record, right, with power levels, we're using the Scouter to measure all of that. Um, and I find that fascinating. And then with the Saiyan part, and we'll get to that too, that lore changes everything because Saiyans are like the most popular characters in Dragon Ball, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. And one of the things that is introduced mathematically with them is the idea that they get Zenkai boost, and that gets exploited in that next chapter pretty readily. But anyway, like so, Raditz was an important character, partially because of the Saiyan lore, but also he introduced power level and power scaling, and that's become a big part of Dragon Ball. And let's be honest, when you think about all of that, it's like Raditz introduced a lot of math into the equation. I don't feel good about that, and yet I kind of do. But more seriously, I think that's fascinating. And then when it comes to power levels and power scaling, we see that used a lot throughout the Sand Saga and a lot throughout the Frieza Saga in some interesting ways because like it's a fascinating thing. With power levels or battle power, again, whichever one you prefer, I might jump back and forth with them throughout this. Um, but the idea is with power levels, they're as good as the tools that are measuring them. And with those tools, they don't take into account the ability to raise or lower a power level. They don't take account using your power and burst, and they don't take into account transformations, which we see later. So it can be very misleading. And I think not only is that interesting and useful within the series, and also kind of messes with your head a bit, as well as the opponents in the story, but it's a very useful lesson on data analysis, math and statistics overall, right? Because here's the thing, right? Collecting data is important. But when you do, you have to consider things like what is being measured, how is it being measured, and by what, and with what, or sorry, by who, and with what. And what are you trying to just get across overall, right? In this case, it's just like the power levels consider someone's base power, and in that particular universe, okay, that works for a lot of people, but it doesn't work for people who are expert fighters, notably the ones that are on Earth who like they're doing some different things. And so you get someone like Raditz, who doesn't know any better, someone like Vegeta and Nappa later on who don't know any better, and Vegeta picks up on things quickly though, and Frieza doesn't know any better either. But again, like later depictions, he's figured things out somehow. Um, but it's just kind of crazy just from that idea. And then just like so many other things that come with the story get kind of crazy because like with Goku, he ends or his power level is like, and like I said, in the 300s in his base at the Saiyan Saga, you know, he gets killed by Raditz or self-sacrifice, however you want to view that. You know, um, he does his training with King Kai, and he comes back, and his power level is a little over 8,000. I assume a little bit, but and yeah, I know the meme is like it's over 9,000, but it's like originally it was 8,000, and that was a dub change. But and some of you may have known that. But that being said, that meme is still funny. Um, but anyway, so you go from 300 for his power level to 8,000 in a year, and that's like a more powerful jump than anything we've seen up until that point because we don't know the power levels from Dragon Ball. And if you say that you've seen those, yeah, maybe you come across them, but they're not legit. Um, so we don't actually know power levels in Dragon Ball. That part of the story, like the earlier Dragon Ball stuff, but we know that that's an insane jump, right? And to go to 300 to 8,000. Um, and then what makes it crazier is like, okay, that's in a year's time, right? And it's like, okay, whatever, right? But then in 6 days, Goku gets some crazy jumps, right? Because he goes from 8,000 to like around I think 60,000. I think, yeah. Like when he gets on to Namek and he's fighting like Berter and Jace and Ginyu, um, and you know it's like it's pretty crazy, right? Because then he goes on to after he gets healed up after that battle, he gets a crazy Zenkai, and he's at like 3 million. And none of what I said is like calculating Kaioken into equation, but the idea is just like, so in just a little over a year's time, this dude goes from 300 for his power level to 3 million for his power level, and this is just in the base, right? So it's an insane jump, considering that like a lot of that happened like in a little over 6 days or something like that. And it's like that's crazy. And then by the end of the saga, he's at 150 million. Um, so yeah, it's kind of crazy, and that's what is Super Saiyan transformation. And then it's just like wild because Frieza's power level was just insane. Because when you start off the saga, he's at over like 500 thousand for his power level, and that's him like holding back because the way his forms like worked initially is like his first form isn't his initial form. It's a form created to like hold back power, as are the other ones, with the fourth form being his original form. And then even when he goes to that form, he's still not at his max power. It's a crazy thing. And I think what at his max he's at 120 million compared to Goku's 150 million by the time that's done. But my whole thing is just like power levels got crazy from the Saiyan Saga to the Namek Saga or Frieza Saga, whatever you prefer, and the idea of power levels like have never really diminished. And people have concocted all different power levels throughout the years, but none of them have really been legit. The last one that we see in the series is a suppressed Trunks who like Frieza's warriors thought he was at like 5 for the power level. So I find it also hilarious that the first power level we see is 5 and the last power level we see is 5. But yeah, so as you can tell just from this discussion on power levels alone, again, like battle power if you prefer, there's a lot of math to discuss, and people have tried to scale characters over the years to varying degrees of success. And then it's like there's multipliers with different transformations, notably the Super Saiyan form, which is a 50 times multiplier of the person's base. And just you might be good with this, but I've seen some places like online where some people don't understand that the bases are variable; they're not fixed. um, so I just wanted to put that out there. Like the bases, they change over time and with training. Um, and then you add a transformation on top of that, and it gets crazy. Um, yeah, so it's just like that stuff alone is enough to just continue to talk about. But you also have the idea of the Dragon Balls and tracking them down. We've got the seven Dragon Balls, and on Earth, at least when we're introduced to them in Z, it's kind of like the same rule as in the Dragon Ball portion where it's just like one wish. That gets changed later on to like two, and I don't think it's three at any point, but it may have been. But I definitely remember two. And then you have the Namekian Dragon Balls where they have seven of those too, but there's three. And so with the Dragon Balls, you have like how many there are, how many they are, how many wishes you get, and how long it takes for you to be able to wish for them again. Not to mention, like the time it takes to track down the Dragon Balls and the locations that they are, and the Dragon Ball radar is very helpful. And it's like that's math in motion too. And then like you have the fights themselves, right? Like they're crazy because you have these characters moving at this insane, like these insane speeds and moving with crazy power. So you have like math in their strength, math in their speed, math in how they stack up to one another. And as they're moving around, like not only are they considering their position, but they're considering their opponent's position. And they're like compare their speed and strength to their opponents and their sense and key if they could do it. And there's math in all of these things and all of the back and forth and who gets to win out and how much energy is exhausted when you're shooting out your key. And it gets crazy. So like the battles are inherently mathematical, and whether we're talking about on the page or on the screen, there's math in getting them across too. When we're dealing with the manga, right? Like we're dealing with how the action is depicted, right? Like for starters, like with the manga, there's math in that, right? Math in the panels, like how many panels are used, math in how you use the space in those panels, math in how you draw the characters, math in how you scale the characters, math in how you get across like their speed and their strength, math in the coloring, math in the inking, math in the schedule it takes to make the manga. I mean, Toriyama did that manga for like 11 years, weekly. So it's just like it's a crazy thing, right? And then on the screen, it's like, well, how do you get across these motions too? Because like on the page, it's like, well, maybe you do like motion lines and stuff like that, and you see these sort of tricks used in the anime too. But it's just like, okay, see, now we're actually moving now, so you're not just getting across that illusion of moving, like you're moving in that context of the world, and you're getting that across to people. And there's math in that, right? There's math in animation. There's math in the choreography, which is largely adapted from the manga. There's math in getting across like speed in different ways, right? Because like maybe a character is like barely moving and everyone else is moving super fast around that character, or maybe other characters are barely moving and that character is moving so quickly, or maybe we don't get to really see that character move fast but we see things happening as a result. Or you have characters who are about even and like they're going at it and then they move faster and faster and faster, and no matter how you cut it, there's math across the board and it's crazy, right? And then there's math in the training. We see a bit more training in the anime compared to the manga, and no matter how you cut it though, whether you see that training or not, there's math in it, right? There's math in how these people push themselves, math in them fighting each other, math in the exercises that they're doing. If gravity is involved in the training, there's math in that too, right? And there's math in them just raising their key and learning techniques and how to use their energy better. And it's just like, it's crazy. And there's just so much math in Dragon Ball. Like I said, whether we're talking about on the page or on the screen, right? And then, not to mention, there are a lot of Dragon Ball games, and there's especially a lot of Dragon Ball Z games. And even when a game no longer has that moniker, like no longer has a Dragon Ball Z moniker, they deal with a lot of stuff from Dragon Ball Z. Um, so I'm gonna pause the video for a second, which shouldn't affect you greatly, but I want to make sure I have room to just like record and go all out for this. I might get super off the rails if I'm not considered to be that right now. So we'll see. All right, we will see. So I will be right back in a second. All right, so we're back. And I realized that I didn't really have to like say that I was leaving, and I've been doing that for these longer videos. But either way, I like to put it out there. But anyway, we're back, and we're gonna talk about like the games for a second. So, like I said, right, there's been a lot of Dragon Ball games, and of those Dragon Ball games, there's been a lot of Dragon Ball Z games, and that focus particularly on like that part of the story, like the Sand Saga, Cell Saga, and Boo Saga. Although there's some that just focus on the Sand Saga going up to the Cell Saga, and that's kind of weird. But overall, it's like there's so much story out there, and I like the Dragon Ball Z side of the story. Like I wouldn't keep on coming back to it if I didn't. But it's kind of crazy that there's not a lot of games with the Dragon Ball segments. That earlier part of the Dragon Ball, and it's crazy that we haven't really seen anything with Super. Um, but in any case, we see all sorts of genres with Dragon Ball games, right? Notably, again, like Dragon Ball Z games. And it's kind of crazy to me because, yeah, you get fighting games. You get a lot of fighting games, but over time, you get a lot of fighting games that have RPG elements. Or, you get beat 'em up games, and you get card games. You get a surprising amount of card games. Like it's crazy because like when I was younger, right, I played this game called Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors, and I've done a video on that. And it's on my Math and Dragon Ball list. Shameless plug is shameless. But that was the first time that I played um a Dragon Ball Z card game. And here's the thing, right? Like I've seen the card element come back up in different games, like Xenoverse and Xenoverse 2. There's an element of that in Dragon Ball Z, like Kakarot. And then you have like the whole like Dragon Ball Hero series that is all about the card games. But yeah, so Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warrior was the first like Dragon Ball game where it was a card game that I played. Just to be clear, it's not the first Dragon Ball card game. I think like some of the earlier Dragon Ball games were card games, but some of them did not make it over here to the states, right? Um, but I bring that up is just because, like, okay, there's math in gaming. There's a lot of math in gaming and a lot of math in those genres, right? Um, so let's talk about like fighting games. Like, there's a lot of Dragon Ball like fighting games to go off of, and you know what? It makes sense. Dragon Ball is a series, but dominantly about fighting at a certain point, right? Because there was more of the adventure stuff in Dragon Ball, but it became more about the fighting, and it certainly is over time, right? Um, and so it makes sense that you end up getting a lot of fighting games. And I think what's cool about that is like when we talk about a game like Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3, which is my favorite Dragon Ball game of all time and one of my favorite games, period, because it's freaking awesome. Um, this is just one example of many, but the idea is like, you have your characters, they have their health, and you're trying to deplete their health while keeping your health, right? And you start out at 100%, they start out 100%, if you're keeping things normal. Um, and you're trying to get them to 0%, and they're trying to get you to 0%. That's one way to look at it. And this is depicted visually, right? Like you see that for the health gauge, and um, if you're using certain items during a story, or if you're fighting the computer or fighting your opponents, you can adjust the health. Um, and no matter how you cut it, though, the health is an inherently mathematical concept and it's depicted visually, right? And so, what do you do to handle that, right? What do you do to get at your opponents? You attack. You could do so through melee attacks. You could do so through basic key blast. You could do so through signature techniques, whether these signature techniques are key blasts or more physical in nature. You could also do, you know, your ultimate combo, and you could also do dragon rushes. Um, and no matter how you talk about it, right, you're dishing out damage. It's inherently mathematical. You're dishing out some damage that is going to take off a certain percentage of their health, right? Um, and their strategy and what you want to do with that, right? Because with melee attacks, they're going to help you build up your key. And you have bars that represent your key, right? Up to seven. Um, and so these, like, sorry, your key gauge allows you to do your more signature attacks like a Kamehameha for Goku, for instance. Um, and also will allow you to do your ultimate attack. Like you might be able to do the Spirit Bomb or something like that, right? Um, but no matter how you cut it, it's something that's inherently mathematical. You know, you're dishing out damage, you're building up ki, you're spending ki. It's cool. And ki also allows you to transform, and transformations allow you to dish out more damage. Nowhere in the same capacity is like in the series, but it does make a slight difference. Like, right, you might get a certain percentage increase to your power. Like, so like if you go Super Saiyan, for instance, but you have to build up the key to do it. And you can't get knocked out of that transformation if you're not careful. But my whole thing is like, so that's a big component of it, right? You have your health, you have dishing out damage while trying to not take it. And when it comes to trying to not take it, you can block a technique, right? But people could also throw you. So that's something to consider. And if you don't have any key at all, that's not going to work the way you want it to work, right? But that's not all. You can also expend key to evade your opponents, like, right? You can do like an after image and teleport behind them. And when it comes to teleportation game, when it comes to Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3, I'm a beast. Um, just saying. Um, but yeah, so there's this math all across the board, right? There's math in your health, math in your key, math in trying to protect your health while trying to take down your opponent's health, and math in how you build and use your key and trying to maintain it throughout the battle. And these battles are pretty fast paced. And also, is you're battling, you could have a beam struggle, in which case, you have to be pressing that button fast enough. And then for the dragon rushes that I mentioned, like it's basically like three attacks that you do in a row provided they're not interrupted. The idea is like you press a button, your opponent presses the button, or the AI decides on a button if you're fighting the AI. Um, if they match, it's done. And if it matches in that first time, they deal damage to you. If you get through that first attack, you do some damage to them, and on that second attack, you get the same button, it stops neutral damage, right? Or no damage in this case, right? But if you continue, you're able to dish out some more damage to your opponent on that third wave. Um, and if, sorry, but they could block you from doing like a finisher. But if you get through and your opponent has not matched you for any of those, you not only do your attack, but you do a finisher if you have it. Well, I guess like you do it by default, and it could just be like, oh, maybe I'm doing this extra kind of punch or extra kind of series of moves, but you might have something like Final Flash if you have acquired that. And throughout the game or in the story mode, you're building up experience, you're building up Zenny, which is the currency in that game, and the currency in the Dragon Ball universe, and you're using that to power ups. You're using that to buy items. You're also like searching for the Dragon Balls, and you can use those to make wishes. Maybe you unlock some characters. Maybe you unlock some sort of power up. Maybe you unlock different items. Whatever the case may be. I think there's maybe one option to wish for more money. But either way, Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3 is an awesome game, and I dig it. And some of the things that I described, they might vary from game to game, but there's a lot of math in that idea of fighting, right? And dishing out damage while trying to avoid it. And also, like for the more RPG elements, there's math and getting experience points and leveling up and building up currency to buy different items and power ups. And you see that throughout various Dragon Ball titles. And for the card game, you have some of the things that I just said. Then you have some different things, but the idea is um, you still have the idea of dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it. And then like Dragon Ball Z, like Legendary Super Warriors, it's like you, I think it was like four attacks that you had where you had to get the button presses, and that allowed you to build up some different power. And you were collecting cards that allow you to do, additional damage or protect yourself. And there's a variety of effects. And then you have like the stats of your characters. And then, it's a turn-based sort of deal, so you have to take that strategy into account. And then you have something like Dragon Ball Z, like Kakarot, where it kind of like dives into the RPG element of it. It's like I'd argue it's more of that like it's kind of like a crazy fusion because like it's an RPG, but it's still like a fighter. But it's also like an adventure game. It's a lot of things. It's like kind of what a lot of like early 2000s Dragon Ball games were, but like more refined and deliberate in some of those choices, if that makes any sort of sense. Because you might have had like some games that were primarily fighters, but had like some RPG elements and some adventure elements. But you know, honestly, you can make arguments about genre, and how well like these fit in that. But my whole thing is like with Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, it added like a lot, and it was kind of crazy, like fun though. So, but that I have so much more to say about Dragon Ball games, because it's like I've played a lot in my day, um, and it's like again, like a lot of them take from Z. Either directly they're about Z or like they take inspiration because just like you have Xenoverse and you have Xenoverse 2. Xenoverse 2 is like a more refined Xenoverse 1, but it pretty much repeats the story, let's be honest. But it plays really well. And then with Xenoverse 1, it's doing its own thing. You're on a time patrol and they have some new story elements, but in terms of like the big fights, you're pretty much reliving the Dragon Ball Z days. Let's be honest. So because I like Xenoverse and I like Xenoverse too, but they're very dependent on like Dragon Ball Z, as well as like some of the more Dragon Ball Online stuff. But I think that's actually a good thing because we didn't really get that over here. Um, and I'm not saying those things are inherently bad because Dragon Ball Z works for a reason, but it's just like it's worth noting. So I'm trying to think how much more I want to talk about things. I guess like one of my big things is like I want to talk a little bit more about how it was for me growing up with it. So, and it's just like there's math and how that happened too, right? Like because I originally would watch Dragon Ball Z like on Saturday mornings, right? Like every week I would watch it, and when it came to the dub, they only had it dubbed up to a certain point. Like they only had it dubbed up until like Goku comes on Namek and he fights Raccoon. But we'd watch that on repeat. And then Tanami started doing more anime, right? And they had Dragon Ball Z, and it blew up. And so Tanami's still around, and if you're not too familiar with it, or just to like remind you, it's a block of time where there's a bunch of shows, primarily anime, and it's like not only do you have these shows, but in between the shows, yes, you have regular ads, but you also have this story of what's going on with any given character. It's kind of like a show within a show, sort of. Let me put it a different way. So with Tanami, it's like you had a host, like I think Morello at first, but like or something like that. But Tom was the most long running host, still is, I think. He's been through different versions, but the whole thing is like um, within that concept, it's like there's a ship and there's a host, and that host is like giving an introduction to these shows, and they might be going on their own journey in between it. And it was awesome growing up. And Dragon Ball Z was one of their big shows. I'd argue their biggest. Um, and it's kind of crazy, right? Because it's like there's math in how Tanami was blocked off, right? It's like, oh, maybe we're gonna give 2 hours, or maybe we're gonna give three, right? Like, well, maybe we run this 5 to 7, or maybe we run this 4 to 7. Um, but there's math in how long it is. There's math in how these shows are blocked off, and like math and hyping them up, and having animation done within the Tanami part, if that makes sense. And so it's just like that was cool. And so like I went from watching it every week to watching it 5 days a week on Tanami. And keep in mind, this was a pre-streaming era, so this was a big deal, you know. And so I watched it, and they got back to the raccoon thing, and I think they did that a few times, and then all of a sudden it's like more episodes because like here's the thing, right? When we were kids, we're like, okay, that can't be how the series ends, right? But we didn't know. So you had new episodes, and they made a big freaking deal about it, as well that they should. Um, I think it was like they called it a second coming or something. Um, But anyway, it was huge. And then over the years, right, for several, excuse me, for several years, they played things how it's like we would get a saga and then they might repeat it for a while and then we would get new episodes and they'd make a big deal of like getting those episodes and it was huge. They had different intro with different music and it was just awesome. And speaking of music, right, you can't get around Dragon Ball without music for the shows. And Dragon Ball Z is interesting because you know it's like the original Japanese version has its own track, right? As all other anime that gets dubbed, right? But the thing that they did with Dragon Ball Z is they dubbed their own music. I mean, they made their own music, and some people don't like that. And honestly, it's weird that they did it because Dragon Ball slash Dragon Ball Z music is actually really good on its own. But I do like some of the stuff that was made. Some of it's epic, and I think denying that is dumb. I said what I said, but seriously speaking, I think it's like I think you can have a problem with the fact that they felt the need to make music for something that already had great music. I think you can have issue with that, and you know be okay with having an issue with that. But I think it's kind of like pointless to say like, oh well, this other um, soundtrack for this isn't good. It's like most of the people say that haven't really heard it, and the other thing is just like I've heard both tracks, and I like them. So it's just like I don't think it was a good decision to like make their own because I think like as kids we would have been fine with the original Japanese tracks, but something good did come out of it, right? Because so I could say, hey, well, I like the Japanese soundtrack for Dragon Ball Z, but hey, I also like the American dub soundtrack for it. They're both good. We got good music either way. But no matter how you cut it, whether you like it or not for either soundtrack, there's math involved, right? There's math in how the music is composed, right? There's math in the notes, how they're strung together, how they're played, how long they're played and with what, how they're used throughout the series, right? Because like you're not gonna get the complete tracks used, right? You're gonna be exposed to different like motifs, right? Different signature parts of the track. Um, and it's just like there's math in like constructing those motifs. There's math in using them in different scenes. Math in the production as well, in the editing. And I think that's cool. There's just like math all around in that music. And speaking of editing, right? There's math and different editing and transitions that you see throughout the series, and some are done really well. There's math in animation, like I was saying earlier, but not just the animation itself, but how it's produced, right? Because there's money that went into that, and there's different studios under different deadlines that worked on it. Because it wasn't just like one studio working on Dragon Ball Z, right? Don't get me wrong. It's like you had Toei making the whole thing, but you know they outsourced to different studios, and so certain parts of Dragon Ball Z are gonna look different than certain other ones. But no matter how you cut it, right? There's math in how that animation is done, and what you're seeing, and how it was made, and when it was made, and under the deadlines of which it was made, if that makes sense. Um, and here's the thing, right? Um, there's so many other things you could say, right? And I think one of the last things I'm going to say um, is like about the voice acting. So right, there's a lot of math in that, right? There's a math in like, of course, how loud you're saying something, but also how fast. There's math in the timing, math in the breathing, math in the different choices and consistency that a voice actor is making. There's math in that dubbing process. There's math across the board in voice acting, and I think that's really cool. And I'm a big fan of voice acting. And for me, you know, I've watched things subbed and I've watched them dubbed. I like both versions. And I will say, um, there was weird choices that that the dub made in terms of like the story, but it didn't destroy like the story overall. It's just like stuff that you look back and you say, okay, that was a weird choice. I'll say with voice acting though, I think they've always had a solid cast. Whether we're talking about the Ocean dub or the Funimation in-house dub later on. So that's some of what I wanted to say because I feel like I could talk about this stuff for days. But I'll kind of like close it out by talking about like the crazy amount that of impact that Dragon Ball has had on my life. So I started watching Dragon Ball Z when I was 10, and I watched that for years and years and years, some of my teenage years, because it was still going over here. And along the way, I was watching Dragon Ball Z and watching Dragon Ball, and eventually I get exposed to the manga. Eventually, I watched GT. I like parts of GT. I can admit that. But there was a lot I didn't like. And if other people like it, that's fine, right? There's parts of it I didn't gel with. But anyway, like I've played a lot of Dragon Ball games. Again, like there's a lot of Dragon Ball Z ones. Um, Watched Super. Watched a lot of the movies. And when they had the movies on Tanami, like they make a big deal of that too. It is like really cool. Not every movie was a hit, but a lot of it was, and it's just fun to see Dragon Ball evolve over the years. And I know not everyone likes Super, but I don't care. Super is not perfect by any means, but I dug it overall, and I think like even if people had issues with the regular series, it's like come on, you can't deny that those movies are awesome. And I know some people had issues with like the Tournament of Power stuff, but it's like that was an awesome arc. There's a lot of good stuff that happened in that arc, a lot of awesome fights and a lot of good music. But yeah, so like I like Super more than I don't, and I think part of it is just like it felt like more of a continuation of Dragon Ball Z than GT did, if that made sense. No shade on GT for that. It's just like that's how I felt. Um, but anyway, so currently Dragon Ball, continues to be, in my life. I'm making a video about it right now, and I've made like 80 others at this point. Oh, we're gonna get to 100 at least. Um, but even before that, it made a large impact on my life. Like it was like I enjoyed the story, I enjoyed the characters, and I like how fun they made training feel, and that epicness, and that idea that you can get stronger, you can get faster if you work for it, you can do it. And that was inspirational to me, right? Like that's a big part of me wanting to work out, is because I got hyped from what I saw from Dragon Ball Z, and just like the epicness and the scale of that all, right? And then there's math in that exercise, but that's another video, right? Like that I've done. But my whole thing though is that not only did it inspire me to more actively exercise and stream train and stuff like that, but it was just that idea of changing and transformation in general that like stuck with me. And there were just so many great moments that I've had while watching or reading Dragon Ball or playing Dragon Ball. And it started with Z, and there's just so many connections that I formed with other people because of that anime and because of Dragon Ball as a whole. So I started watching Dragon Ball Z, like I said, when I was 10, which is over 25 years ago, and it has been like a consistent part of my life, and I am glad for that. Not everything has been perfect, but it's been great, and I've enjoyed it. And while we're here and we're talking about Dragon Ball Z, I gotta say, the Great Saiyaman stuff grows on ya. Like if you didn't like it growing up, or you're not like completely sold, I feel like it's pretty good. So that's what I want to say in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it. Like I said, Dragon Ball Z was a big part of my life. It was big already before Toonami, but it became even bigger during and after. So Dragon Ball is awesome. Dragon Ball Z is awesome. I'm a huge Dragon Ball fan, and if you ever want to talk Dragon Ball with me, let's talk Dragon Ball. I'll see you in the future.